Hey guys, tonight we begin with a dot in a margin that shouldn't be there. Not a smudge or an accident, but a deliberate mark placed with surgical precision exactly 3/4 of an inch from the edge of the parchment, level with the fourth line of text. This is about Manor scribes in 15th century England who developed a code using margin dots to pass messages under the noses of the lords who employed them, the ecclesiastical authorities who supervised them, and the government officials who occasionally inspected their work. It's about how tiny marks, invisible to anyone not looking for them, became a complete communication system, and how discovering this system changes everything you thought you knew about medieval manuscripts and the people who created them.
Before we begin, let me ask something. If you're the kind of person who gets excited about hidden codes, about communication systems that operate in plain sight, about how the powerless find ways to talk to each other despite surveillance, you're in exactly the right place. Take a moment to subscribe to Quiet Manor Story if that sounds like you, and tell me in the comments whether you've ever found secret messages in old books or documents. I'm genuinely fascinated by who joins me for these explorations of historical cryptography. Now settle in, perhaps get comfortable, and let's discover what happens when margins stop being blank space and start being conversations.
The manor is Thornfield in Yorkshire, and the year is 1473. England is between the chaos of the Wars of the Roses and whatever fresh hell is coming next, which means everyone is trying to figure out which faction will win so they can be on the correct side when the fighting stops. Manor houses throughout England are producing documents, letters, legal records, copies of religious texts, and all of these documents require scribes to actually write them. Printing exists, but it's expensive and rare. Most writing is still done by hand, by people trained specifically in the art of clear, consistent, readable script.
Thomas Blackwell is 26 years old and has been a scribe at Thornfield Manor for 8 years. He's good at his job, which means his letters are uniform, his lines are straight, his abbreviations are standard, and his output is consistent. He can copy 20 pages of Latin text per day with errors. He can write legal documents in the precise formulaic language that makes them legally binding. He can produce correspondence in the appropriate register for whatever noble or church official his employer, Lord Edmund, needs to communicate with. Thomas is, in short, exactly the kind of invisible skilled labourer that keeps medieval England functioning.
He's also quietly terrified because he's just discovered that the margins of the manuscript he's copying contain a message that could get everyone in the scriptorium executed for treason. Thomas has been working on this particular manuscript for 3 weeks. It's a copy of Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, commissioned by Lord Edmund for his personal library. Standard work. Thomas has copied this text before. He knows it by heart at this point. The Latin is straightforward. The illuminations are minimal. It should be completely routine.
Except Thomas has noticed something odd about the exemplar he's copying from. The original manuscript, borrowed from another manor house, has tiny dots in its margins. Not decorative, not part of the border designs. Just small, precise dots placed at seemingly random intervals throughout the text. Thomas has been a scribe long enough to know what intentional marks look like. These are intentional. Someone put them there deliberately, which means they mean something.
He starts paying attention, counts the dots, measures their placement, maps their positions relative to the text, and slowly, over the course of several days of careful observation while pretending to just be copying, Thomas realizes he's looking at a code. The dots correspond to letters in the main text. Specific placements indicate specific letters. The sequence of dots spells out words, and those words are discussing troop movements, allegiances, and plans for supporting the Yorkist faction in ways that would be considered treasonous by the current Lancastrian authorities.
Thomas stops working, sits back, stares at the manuscript in front of him. Someone has been using margin dots to pass military intelligence disguised as a philosophical text about the nature of fate and virtue. The book looks innocent, reads innocent, but the margins are having an entirely different conversation for anyone who knows how to read them.
He should report this to Lord Edmund, should point out that the manuscript they borrowed contains coded treasonous content, should distance himself from whatever conspiracy is being conducted via margin dots. That's the safe choice, the loyal choice, the choice that keeps Thomas employed and alive.
Except Thomas is also quietly sympathetic to the Yorkist cause, not actively participating, not stupid enough to declare his allegiances openly, but sympathetic. And he's now looking at a communication system that's apparently sophisticated enough to pass messages between manor houses without anyone except the scribes noticing. A system that uses the most boring, routine, universally ignored aspects of manuscripts, the blank margins, to conduct conversations that the actual text is specifically designed to obscure.
It's brilliant. It's terrifying. And Thomas wants to know how it works.
He doesn't copy the dots. That's his first decision. He reproduces the text of the consolation perfectly, but his margins remain clean. No dots, no code. Lord Edmund will receive a beautiful, accurate copy of Boethius, with absolutely no treasonous intelligence embedded in its margins. Thomas is protecting his employer, while also not destroying the evidence of the code system he's discovered.
The second decision is harder. He needs to know if this is a widespread practice or an isolated incident. Needs to know if other scribes are doing this. Needs to understand the system well enough to determine whether it's safe to participate in it, or whether he's looking at a conspiracy that's about to be exposed. He starts examining other manuscripts in Thornfield's library, looking at margins he's previously ignored, searching for dots.
He finds them. Not in every manuscript, not even in most, but in enough. Someone has been using the Thornfield Library's manuscripts to pass messages for years, and Thomas never noticed, because he was trained to look at text, not margins. Margins are blank space, irrelevant, the place where you rest your eyes between lines. Nobody pays attention to margins.
Except margins aren't blank. They're full of tiny, deliberate marks that spell out conversations if you know how to read them. Thomas spends a week decoding the dots he finds, learning the system. It's not complicated once you understand the principle. Each dot's position relative to the line of text indicates a letter. Horizontal position determines which letter of the alphabet. Vertical position provides context, whether it's a new word, whether it's part of a longer phrase, whether it's punctuation. The code is elegant in its simplicity and nearly invisible to anyone not actively looking for it.
Thomas discovers that the margins are discussing everything from grain prices to military allegiances to personal feuds between noble families. The scribes who created these manuscripts were having entire parallel conversations in the margins while ostensibly copying religious or classical texts. They were building a communication network that operated completely under the noses of the people who employed them.
And Thomas wants in. He wants to be part of this, wants to use his position as a scribe to participate in conversations that aren't monitored by lords or church officials or government inspectors, wants to have some small measure of power and privacy in a world where he has neither. He's a skilled labourer with no political influence and minimal autonomy. But he can put dots in margins. And if those dots mean something, if they connect him to other scribes in other manners, if they let him participate in networks that the powerful don't even know exist, that's worth the risk.
He starts with a test.
He's copying a letter for Lord Edmund to another lord 30 miles away. Standard diplomatic correspondence about nothing in particular. Thomas copies the letter perfectly as required, and in the margins he places 3 dots, carefully, precisely, using the code system he's deciphered. The dots spell out a simple message. Can you read this? Not a question mark. The code doesn't do punctuation easily. Just the 3-word question placed in the margin of a letter that will be read by the recipient lord and then probably filed away by their scribe. If the recipient's scribe knows the code, they'll see Thomas's message. If they don't, the dots will go unnoticed and Thomas's test will fail harmlessly. Either way, he'll learn whether this communication system is still active or if he's discovered an abandoned practice.
The reply takes 3 weeks. That's how long it takes for correspondence to travel 30 miles, be read, generate a response, and return to Thornfield. When the return letter arrives, Thomas is the one who opens it in the scriptorium to prepare it for Lord Edmund's review. And in the margin, level with the salutation, there are 5 dots. Thomas's hands shake slightly as he measures their positions. Decode them. They spell out, "Yes, we can." Thomas has just confirmed that he's part of a network, an active, functional communication system using margin dots to pass messages between Manor House scribes across Yorkshire and possibly beyond. He's no longer just a copyist. He's a node in a network, a participant in conversations that exist parallel to and hidden within the official documents he produces every day.
He needs to learn more, needs to understand the scope of this system, needs to know who else is involved and what they're discussing, and whether this is purely about sharing information or if there's a larger purpose. He starts being more deliberate about checking margins, starts noting patterns, starts recognizing different scribes by their dot placement style. Some prefer dots slightly closer to the text, some slightly use variation in dot size to add emphasis. Over the next 3 months, Thomas identifies at least 7 other scribes in the network. They're all copying the same kinds of documents he is: religious texts, legal records, diplomatic correspondence. All producing clean, professional work that their employers trust implicitly. And all using the margins to conduct conversations about everything from the incompetence of local nobility to the actual state of military campaigns, to more personal matters like which scribes are looking for work or who has access to particularly good quality parchment. The margins are alive. That's what Thomas realizes. They're not dead space. They're not blank. They're a complete parallel text that exists alongside and independent of the official content. Every manuscript in England potentially contains 2 texts, the one everyone reads and the one only scribes see. It's like discovering that every book has a secret chapter that's been hiding in plain sight the entire time. Thomas starts contributing, carefully. He adds dots to margins when he's copying texts that will be sent to other manors. He responds to questions he sees in margins of manuscripts that pass through Thornfield. He becomes part of the conversation, and the conversation is remarkable. The scribes are discussing politics with a sophistication that suggests they understand the conflicts and factions better than many of the nobles they work for. They're sharing information about crop failures and taxation rates and military movements. They're coordinating about practical matters. Who needs an apprentice? Who has access to better quality ink? Who knows how to repair water-damaged parchment? But they're also building solidarity, creating a community of skilled workers who are otherwise isolated in their individual manor houses, working alone in scriptorium, producing documents without any connection to the other people doing identical work elsewhere. The margin dots create connection, Create the possibility of conversation between people who would never otherwise meet. Create a network where information and support can flow, regardless of the political boundaries and hierarchies that normally prevent servants from organizing. That's when Thomas understands what he's really discovered. This isn't just a clever code. This is resistance. Subtle, quiet, nearly invisible resistance to the complete surveillance and control that lords maintain over their servants. The margins are the one space that nobles don't read, the one place where scribes can talk to each other without being monitored, and they've built an entire communication infrastructure in that space.
It changes how Thomas works, changes how he thinks about the documents he produces. Every manuscript is now two things: the official text and the margin conversation. Every page he copies contains both what he's required to write and what he chooses to add. He's performing his duty and subverting it simultaneously, creating documents that serve his employer's purposes while also serving his own purposes. The dots are so small, so easily overlooked, that nobody notices them unless they're looking specifically for them. And nobles don't look at margins, they look at text.
That's the genius of the system. It exploits the attention patterns of the powerful. Lords care about content, about what the text says, about whether the Latin is correct and the legal formulas are properly executed, and the correspondence conveys the appropriate tone. They don't care about margins. Margins are the scribe's concern, the technical aspect of page layout, too boring and too detailed for noble attention. So the margins become free space, space where scribes can operate without oversight, space where they can build something that the powerful don't even know exists. Thomas has been working at Thornfield for 8 years. He has produced thousands of pages of manuscript. He's been a faithful, competent, invisible servant. And now he's something else too. He's a participant in a secret communication network, a keeper of codes, a member of a community that exists in the margins of the very documents that supposedly represent the complete truth of what's being said and done in medieval England.
The first crisis comes 4 months after Thomas joins the network. A manuscript arrives from a manor house that's been searched by royal authorities, inspected for evidence of treason. They were looking for letters, documents, explicit written plans. They didn't find anything incriminating in the text, but Thomas looks at the margins of the manuscript that survived the search and sees dots spelling out a warning. They are watching. Be careful with all correspondence. The network is under threat. Not because anyone has discovered the margin code specifically, but because the general atmosphere of suspicion and surveillance has intensified. Royal authorities are conducting more searches, examining more documents, looking for any evidence of disloyalty to whichever faction currently holds power. And while they're not looking at margins yet, they might. All it takes is one inspector who happens to notice the dots, one curious official who wonders why there are margins in the margins, one break in the network, and the entire system could be exposed. Thomas discusses this with the other scribes via margin messages. They debate whether to stop using the code temporarily, whether to modify it to make it even less visible, whether to continue despite the risk, because stopping would mean losing the connections they've built. The conversation happens over weeks, spread across multiple manuscripts, with different scribes contributing different perspectives. It's the slowest group discussion imaginable, but it's also remarkably thoughtful. Everyone understands the stakes. Everyone knows that exposure means not just personal danger, but destruction of the entire network. They decide to continue, but with modifications. Smaller dots, more careful placement, shortened messages that convey meaning with fewer marks.
enhanced security about which manuscripts get dot messages and which don't. They are adapting the system to the increased threat level, making the invisible even more invisible, trusting that the nobles won't start caring about margins just because they're conducting more thorough searches of content.
Thomas implements the new protocols. His dots become nearly microscopic, placed with such precision that you need to know exactly where to look to find them. He reduces his message frequency, only adding dots when he has something important to share or when he's responding to something critical. The margins become quieter, but not silent. The network contracts slightly, becomes more careful, more disciplined, but it survives.
And it keeps evolving. Some scribes start using variations in ink tone to add another layer of encoding. Others develop signals for urgent messages versus routine information. The system becomes more sophisticated as the threats increase. The margins are no longer just blank space with dots. They're becoming a complete language with grammar and conventions and subtle variations in style that convey meaning to people who know how to read them.
Thomas has been at Thornfield for 8 years. He'll be here for many more. Every day he produces documents that look completely innocent. Every day he adds tiny marks that transform those documents into something else. Every day he participates in conversations that powerful people don't know are happening. The margins are alive with messages. The dots are spelling out resistance. And Thomas has learned that blank space is never truly blank when people need places to talk.
The habits change. Thomas approaches every manuscript differently now. Doesn't just read the text, reads the margins too, looks for dots before he looks at words, understands that the truth of what a document is saying might be in the margins rather than the content. He's trained his eyes to see what's invisible to everyone else, trained his attention to focus on what nobles ignore.
The quiet rules emerge naturally. Never put dots in documents that will be read aloud. Never encode messages in manuscripts intended for church officials who might be more observant about page details. Always test new correspondence with harmless messages before sharing anything sensitive. Trust the margins, but verify that the person reading them is part of the network before revealing anything important. The rules aren't written anywhere. They're transmitted through practice and example, and occasional warnings in margin messages when someone gets too careless.
The threats multiply. More searches, more inspections, more nobles worrying about loyalty and treason and who can be trusted. The network responds by becoming smaller, tighter, more disciplined. But it doesn't stop, can't stop, because once scribes have learned they can talk to each other, once they've built connections across distances that usually isolate them completely, once they've discovered that the margins are spaces where they have agency, giving that up would mean returning to a silence that now feels intolerable.
Thomas sits in the Thornfield scriptorium, copying a legal document about property transfers, and adds 3 dots in the margin, spelling out, "Still here." It's a message to whoever reads this document next, whoever is part of the network, whoever needs to know that the conversation continues despite everything. The dots are tiny, nearly invisible, completely meaningless to anyone not looking for them. But to Thomas and the other scribes in the network, those 3 dots are a statement of survival, of persistence, of refusal to be completely silenced, even when silence is the safest option.
The margins have voices now. Small, quiet, nearly invisible voices, but voices nonetheless. And once you've learned to hear them, you can never stop listening.
The network operates successfully for 18 months before someone makes a catastrophic mistake. Not Thomas. A scribe named William at a manor house 60 miles south of Thornfield gets careless. He's copying a diplomatic letter that will be read aloud at a council meeting, and he forgets the primary rule. Never put coded messages in documents that will be vocally performed. Margins get ignored when people are reading silently, but when someone reads aloud, they're looking at every inch of the page, tracking their place, making sure they don't skip lines. That attention sometimes extends to margins.
The letter is read. The noble reading it pauses mid-sentence, looks more closely at the margin, notices the dots, points them out to others present. What are these marks? Are they decoration? Some kind of notation? The scribe who wrote the letter is summoned. William is brought before the council, asked to explain the dots.
Thomas learns about this disaster through margin messages in a manuscript that arrives at Thornfield 3 weeks later. The dots spell out William caught, margin code questioned, network compromised. Thomas's stomach drops. This is the nightmare scenario. Someone in authority has noticed the dots and is asking questions. If William breaks under questioning, if he explains the code, if he names other scribes in the network, everyone is exposed.
Thomas stops using the margin code immediately. That's the smart response to a network breach. Stop all activity. Wait to see what happens. Hope that William doesn't talk, doesn't reveal the system, doesn't provide names. But Thomas also knows that stopping means losing the connections he's built, means returning to the isolation that the network solved, means abandoning the other scribes who might be in danger if the investigation expands.
He's trapped between safety and loyalty, between protecting himself and protecting a community he's been part of for less than 2 years, but that's become essential to his sense of having any agency in his powerless position. The margins have given him a voice. Stopping means silence. Continuing means risk. There's no good option.
The network goes dark. No more margin messages appear in any of the manuscripts Thomas receives. Everyone has made the same calculation he has. Better to be silent than to be caught. The silence is profound. Thomas finds himself looking at margins compulsively, hoping to see dots that aren't there anymore, missing the conversations that used to happen in spaces that now really are blank.
4 weeks after the initial warning, a new manuscript arrives at Thornfield. It's a religious text Thomas has copied before, standard work. He opens it to begin his copy and immediately sees dots in the margin of the first page. His heart races. Someone is still using the code despite the danger. Someone either doesn't know about William's exposure or has decided the risk is acceptable.
Thomas decodes the message carefully. It takes 10 minutes because he's out of practice and nervous. The dots spell out, William held strong, told them decorative marks only, not questioned further. Network may be safe. Relief floods through Thomas. William didn't break, didn't reveal the code, claimed the dots were meaningless decorative elements that some scribes add for aesthetic reasons. It's a plausible lie. Margins do sometimes have decorative elements, and if William maintained that story under questioning, the investigators might have believed it, might have decided the dots weren't worth further investigation. But may be safe isn't the same as is safe. The network has been noticed. Even if William's explanation was accepted, the fact that someone in authority looked closely at margins and found something unusual means margins are no longer completely invisible. The perfect hiding place has been partially exposed. The code can continue,
But everyone knows it's more dangerous now.
Thomas responds to the message with his own margin dots in the next manuscript he sends out. Should we continue or permanently stop? He's asking the network to decide collectively whether the risk is worth it, whether the connections they've built are valuable enough to maintain despite increased danger, whether silence is safer, or whether silence just means giving up the small amount of power they've claimed for themselves. The responses come slowly over the next 6 weeks, spread across different manuscripts, different scribes weighing in with their perspectives. Some argue for permanent cessation. The network was valuable, but not worth execution for treason, if that's the risk. Some argue for continuing with even tighter security, smaller dots, less frequent messages, more careful selection of which documents get coded margins. Some argue for expanding the network despite the danger, recruiting more scribes, making the system so widespread that investigating it becomes impossible.
If you just felt that tension, like watching a community debate its own survival in slow motion, that's exactly why I make these videos. The way secret communication networks adapt to threats, it's fascinating when you see them making collective decisions about risk. Subscribe to Quiet Manor Story if you want more of these moments where hidden systems reveal themselves under pressure.
The network decides to continue, not unanimously. Some scribes drop out, stop participating, return to producing clean manuscripts without margin codes. But enough scribes choose to continue that the network remains functional. They implement stricter protocols. Never code messages in documents that will be read aloud. Reduce message frequency to once per month maximum. Use smaller dots and more complex placement patterns. Add false dots to make the code harder to decipher, even if someone realizes it exists.
Thomas implements these new protocols religiously. His margin messages become rare and terse. He checks every manuscript 3 times before adding dots to make sure it's not intended for public reading. He varies his dot placement patterns to avoid developing a signature style that could be identified. The margins go from being spaces of free conversation to being spaces of very careful, very restricted communication.
But the network survives William's exposure. That's the important part. They were noticed, they were questioned, they were threatened, and they adapted rather than collapsing. The margins are still alive with messages, just quieter ones, more strategic ones, encoded in ways that are harder to detect and decrypt.
Then the expansion happens. One of the scribes proposes recruiting beyond manor houses, bringing in monastic scribes who copy religious manuscripts, town scribes who work for merchants, court scribes who produce legal documents for city governments, turning the network from a manor house phenomenon into something much larger and more diverse. The proposal circulates via margin messages. Thomas reads it with equal parts excitement and terror.
Expanding means more voices, more perspectives, more information flowing through the margins. The monastery scribes know things about church politics that manor scribes don't. The town scribes understand commercial networks that noble households are isolated from. The court scribes see legal precedents and governance mechanisms that never reach manor level. Combining all that knowledge in one network would create an intelligence system that rivals anything the nobility has.
But expanding also means more risk, more people who could betray the network, more chances for exposure, more difficulty maintaining consistent security protocols across different environments with different supervision levels. The Manor House network works partly because everyone operates under similar constraints. Expanding to different contexts means adapting the code to environments that might not be compatible with it. The network debates the expansion proposal for 3 months. Arguments flow through margins across dozens of manuscripts. Some scribes are enthusiastic, some are cautious, some are actively opposed. Thomas contributes his perspective. Expand carefully, test new recruits thoroughly, maintain separate subnetworks so compromise in one area doesn't destroy the whole system. His suggestions get incorporated into the plan. The network decides to proceed with controlled expansion. Thomas is tasked with recruiting the monastic scribes. Makes sense. Thornfield has regular correspondence with several monasteries. Thomas produces religious manuscripts that get sent there. He has legitimate reasons to be in contact with monastic scribes. He starts carefully, adds margin dots to a psalter he's copying for a monastery 30 miles away. Simple test message. Do you know this language? The response takes 5 weeks. When Thomas receives a return manuscript from that monastery, he searches the margins carefully, finds dots, decodes them. We have been using similar for years. Surprised to find Manor scribes doing same. Welcome. Thomas nearly drops the manuscript. The monastic scribes have their own margin code system, independent of the Manor House network, operating on similar principles but developed separately, which means the practice of using margins for coded communication is more widespread than anyone in the Manor network realized. It's not a clever innovation specific to Yorkshire manor houses. It's a response to surveillance that multiple groups of scribes arrived at independently. The margins are a natural space for resistance wherever scribes work under supervision. Thomas communicates this discovery back to the Manor network. The implications are significant. If multiple scribe communities independently developed margin coding, the practice might be nearly universal among scribal workers, which could mean either that it's safer than they thought because it's too widespread to suppress, or that it's more dangerous than they thought because eventually someone in authority will notice a pattern that recurs across different types of manuscripts.
The expansion proceeds. Monastic scribes join the network. Town scribes follow. Court scribes are more difficult to recruit because their work is more heavily supervised, but a few join. By 1475, 2 years after Thomas first discovered the margin code, the network spans most of Yorkshire and is spreading into neighbouring regions. Dozens of scribes, hundreds of manuscripts containing coded margins, thousands of messages passing invisibly through the official documentary systems of church, state, and noble households.
The information flowing through the network becomes more valuable. The monastic scribes report on church politics and theological debates. The town scribes share commercial intelligence about trade routes and market prices. The court scribes occasionally leak information about legal proceedings and government decisions. The manor scribes continue reporting on noble household politics and military developments. Together they're building a picture of how England actually functions that's more complete than what any individual scribe or even any individual noble could see. And they're using that information, not just sharing it for curiosity's sake, but coordinating based on it. When court scribes report that the government is planning to increase taxes on wool exports, town scribes who work for wool merchants use that information to adjust their employers' strategies. When monastic scribes report religious reforms that will affect manor chapel practices, manor scribes quietly prepare their employers for coming changes. The network isn't just about communication. It's about collective action, about using shared information to navigate a world that's designed to keep them powerless and isolated.
That's when the network becomes genuinely dangerous, not just to individual careers if someone gets caught, but to the power structures the network operates within. Information is power. The nobility maintains power partly through information asymmetry. Lords know things servants don't. Church officials know things lay people don't. Government authorities know things subjects don't. The margin code network is undermining that asymmetry. Scribes are sharing information across the boundaries that normally keep it siloed, and they're doing it invisibly, using the very documents that are supposed to reinforce hierarchical information control.
The second crisis comes in 1476. A court scribe in York is arrested for treason, not because of margin codes, because of actual documented involvement in a conspiracy to support one faction over another in the ongoing noble power struggles. The arrest itself wouldn't affect the margin network except for one detail. The authorities seize all manuscripts from the scribe's workplace. They're examining every document the scribe produced for evidence of treason. They're reading every word, looking at every page.
Thomas receives warning about this via margin message. Court scribe arrested. All manuscripts seized. Margins being examined. Severe danger.
This is worse than William's incident. William was questioned about dots in a single document. This is systematic examination of potentially hundreds of manuscripts, any of which might contain coded margins. If the authorities are actually looking at margins now, if they're searching for patterns across multiple documents, they might decode the system, might realize it's not random decorative marks, but a deliberate communication network, might start investigating every scribe whose work shows similar margin patterns.
The network has to decide immediately. Continue and risk complete exposure, or shut down permanently and lose everything they've built. There's no time for the usual slow debate via margin messages. Decisions need to be made quickly. Thomas finds himself in an unexpected position of authority. He's not the oldest scribe in the network, not the most experienced, but he's the one who's been most thoughtful about security protocols, the one whose suggestions for protecting the network have been consistently good. Other scribes defer to his judgment.
Thomas decides the network needs to go dormant but not extinct. Stop all margin coding for 6 months. Let the investigation in York run its course. See if the authorities discover the code or if they focus only on the actual text of the treasonous correspondence. If no one notices the margins after 6 months of examination, the network can resume cautiously. If the code is discovered, everyone who ever participated is in danger and needs to start destroying evidence immediately.
The message goes out through the last margin-coded manuscripts that get sent before the dormancy period begins. Silence for 6 months. Watch for warnings. Prepare for discovery. Every scribe in the network receives it. Everyone understands. The margins go blank. For the first time in 3 years, manuscripts circulate through Yorkshire and surrounding regions without any coded messages in their margins. The silence is total.
Thomas spends those 6 months in a state of constant low-level anxiety. Every time Lord Edmund receives correspondence, Thomas wonders if it contains notification that he's under investigation for treason. Every time an official visitor arrives at Thornfield, Thomas wonders if they're here to arrest him. Every manuscript he copies feels like potential evidence against him if anyone decides to examine his work for patterns that match the York scribe's margin codes.
He destroys evidence. Not dramatically, not obviously, but every manuscript in his personal possession that has margin codes gets accidentally water damaged and has to be disposed of. Every note he's made about code patterns gets burned. Every piece of evidence that he was part of the network disappears. If the authorities come for him, they'll find a completely ordinary scribe who produces clean manuscripts without any suspicious margin activity.
Other scribes do the same. The network is performing collective amnesia, erasing traces of its existence, becoming invisible not just in its operations, but in its history. If the investigation extends beyond York, if authorities start examining manuscripts system-wide for evidence of coded communication, they'll find nothing recent. Just old manuscripts that might have dots in margins that could be interpreted as decorative or could be codes that have been abandoned.
5 months into the dormancy period, Thomas receives news. The York scribe has been tried and executed for treason. The testimony focused entirely on the content of letters he wrote, not on margin codes. The authorities examined hundreds of manuscripts, never mentioned dots, never suggested they'd found any evidence of secret communication systems. The margins were invisible, even under direct scrutiny. The network survived again, and Thomas realizes something crucial. The margin codes are safer than anyone thought. Not because they're impossible to detect, but because nobles don't look at margins, even when they are actively searching manuscripts for evidence. They read text, ignore whitespace, focus on content, and completely overlook the layout details that scribes use for communication. The code is protected, not primarily by its cleverness, but by the attention patterns of the powerful, by the fact that nobles think scribes' technical choices about page layout are too boring and insignificant to matter. That insight changes how Thomas thinks about the network. It's not a temporary advantage that will eventually be discovered. It's a structural feature of how power works. The powerful ignore the details that the powerless use to communicate. That ignorance is reliable, predictable, because margin placement is scribe work, and scribe work is beneath noble attention. Thomas proposes restarting the network with a new understanding. They're not trying to avoid discovery forever. They're exploiting a permanent gap in surveillance created by class hierarchy. Lords won't look at margins, because looking at margins would require thinking about scribe labor, and thinking about scribe labor complicates the fiction that documents produce themselves through some mysterious process that doesn't involve human workers making countless small decisions about layout and spacing and mark placement. The network accepts this analysis, resumes operations after 6 months of silence. But Thomas notices something has changed. The margin messages are different now, less fearful, more confident. The scribes write with the assurance that they're not going to be discovered, because the discovery would require nobles to pay attention to aspects of manuscripts that nobles specifically don't want to think about. The margins have become safer, paradoxically, because the scribes now understand how their invisibility works. The network expands again. More monastery scribes, more town scribes, even a few scribes working directly for government officials join. The expansion is bolder this time, less cautious. The 6 months of silence proved that even systematic examination of manuscripts doesn't reveal the code if examiners aren't looking for it. And nobles never look for it, because looking would mean acknowledging that scribes might have independent thoughts and communication worth paying attention to. Thomas's role in the network grows. He's not formally a leader. The network doesn't have formal leadership, but his messages carry weight. When he suggests security protocols, people follow them. When he proposes new recruits, they're accepted. When he warns about dangers, the network responds. He's become something like a coordinator, the person who sees the whole system and thinks about how to keep it functioning. It's exhausting. Thomas is producing manuscripts for Lord Edmund while also managing a secret communication network that involves dozens of scribes across several counties. He's checking margins on every manuscript he touches. He's encoding and decoding messages constantly. He's coordinating security protocols and new member recruitment and responses to threats. And he's doing it all invisibly, in the margins of his legitimate work, using tiny dots that take seconds to place but hours to decode and synthesize.
His life has split into two parallel tracks. The official track, where he's a competent, invisible scribe producing exactly the documents his employer needs, and the margin track, where he's a key figure in an underground communication network that's quietly undermining the information monopoly that keeps noble power stable. He's both, simultaneously, all the time. The only people who know about the second track are other scribes in the network. Everyone else sees only the first track.
The habits have evolved. Thomas doesn't just check margins anymore. He reads them before he reads text, prioritizes margin information over official content, understands that what's really happening in England is recorded in margins more accurately than in official documents. The nobility think they're controlling information by controlling what gets written in formal texts. They have no idea that the real information, the accurate picture of events, is being compiled by scribes in margins that nobles don't read.
The quiet rules have multiplied. Never code messages in documents for public reading. Always use smallest possible dots. Vary placement patterns to avoid signature styles. Test new members extensively before sharing sensitive information. Maintain sub-networks so compromise in one area doesn't destroy the whole system. Report all near discoveries immediately. Share security innovations across the network. Trust margins, but verify readers before encoding critical information. The rules aren't written. They're transmitted through practice and occasional warnings, and the collective memory of what's worked and what's failed.
The threats have intensified, but so has the network's sophistication in handling them. More government surveillance means more careful security protocols. More noble attention to documents means more careful selection of which manuscripts get coded margins. More scribes in the network means both more potential for discovery and more ability to warn each other about dangers. The network is stronger and more vulnerable simultaneously, balanced on the knife edge between exposure and entrenchment.
Thomas sits in the Thornfield scriptorium 8 years after he first discovered the margin code. He's now 34, has been a scribe for 16 years, has been part of the network for most of the last 8. He's copying a legal document and adding dots that spell out, "Network stronger than ever, nobility still blind to margins, we continue." It's a message to whoever reads this document next, a reminder that the margins are still alive despite everything, still passing messages, still building connections between people who are supposed to be isolated, still exploiting the gap between what nobles see and what actually matters.
The dots are tiny, nearly microscopic, would be invisible to anyone not specifically looking for them. But Thomas places them with confidence now, with the assurance that they won't be discovered, because nobles don't look at margins and never will. The margins belong to scribes. They're the one space where power has failed to extend its surveillance. And in that space, quiet conversations happen, but slowly, incrementally, almost invisibly undermine the hierarchies that think they control everything.
The network has survived exposure, has adapted to threats, has grown despite danger, and Thomas has learned that the most effective resistance isn't always the loudest. Sometimes it's dots in margins, tiny marks that mean nothing to the powerful, but everything to the people who've learned to read them. The margins are full of messages now, full of voices, full of a community that exists in spaces nobles don't see. And once you've heard those voices, once you've learned that margins speak, you can never see documents the same way again. The Margin Code Network operates successfully for 23 years before printing changes everything. It's 1496. William Caxton has been dead for 5 years, but his printing press in Westminster continues producing books. Other printers are setting up operations throughout England.
Printed books are becoming affordable, accessible, common. And printed books have margins too, but those margins are identical across every copy. You can't put unique coded messages in margins that get mass-produced identically in hundreds of copies. The technology that makes books more accessible simultaneously destroys the communication system that Scribes built in handwritten manuscript margins.
Thomas is 49 years old now, has been a scribe for 33 years, has been part of the margin network for 23. He watches printing technology spread and understands what it means, not just for the network, though that's significant, but for the entire profession of scribal work. Printed books are cheaper and faster than manuscripts, more consistent too. No scribal errors, no variations in handwriting, no unique quirks that distinguish one copy from another. Lords are already ordering printed texts instead of commissioning manuscript copies. The demand for scribal labor is declining. The margin network is becoming obsolete, not because it was discovered, but because the technology it depends on is being replaced. Handwritten manuscripts will still exist, especially for personalized documents, legal records, correspondence. But the era of scribes copying books is ending, which means the era of using book margins for coded messages is ending too. The network faces extinction through technological obsolescence rather than through exposure.
Thomas discusses this with other scribes via the margin messages that are becoming rarer as printed books replace manuscripts. The conversations have a melancholy quality. They built something remarkable, something that survived threats and adapted to dangers and grew despite surveillance. And now it's dying, not because anyone defeated it, but because the world changed in ways that made it unnecessary or impossible.
Some scribes argue for adapting the code to printed books, finding ways to add marks to printed margins that are unique to individual copies. But it's not practical. You cannot encode messages in margins that will be read by unknown future buyers of mass-produced books. The whole system depends on knowing who will receive the document you're marking. Printing destroys that specificity. Every copy goes to potentially different readers. There's no way to target margin messages in printed text.
The network begins its slow decline. Not a dramatic collapse, but a gradual fading as handwritten manuscripts become less common and the opportunities for margin coding diminish. By 1500, the network is perhaps a quarter of its peak size. By 1510, it's maintained by only the most dedicated scribes, still producing manuscripts for specialized purposes. By 1520, it's nearly extinct. A few scribes in monasteries and manor houses still use margin codes out of habit, but the system that once spanned multiple counties and involved dozens of scribes has contracted to isolated pockets of practitioners who remember what the margins used to be.
Thomas retires from active scribal work in 1505. He's 58. His eyesight is failing, his hands are arthritic, and the demand for manuscript copying is so low that Lord Edmund's son doesn't need a full-time scribe anymore. Thomas is given a small pension and a room in the manor house. He spends his remaining years reading, which is ironic for someone who spent decades writing, but he finds he enjoys reading more than he ever enjoyed copying, especially reading the margins.
Because even after the margin code network dies, Thomas can't stop reading margins. It's become automatic, instinctive. He opens any book or document and his eyes go to the margins first. Checks for dots, even though he knows they won't be there in printed text. Looks for the tiny marks that used to spell out secret conversations. The habit outlived the practice. The behavior persisted after its purpose ended. Thomas's attention patterns were permanently altered by 23 years of reading coded margins.
He can't unlearn what the margins taught him.
And he notices something interesting. Printed books have marginalia too, not coded dots, but handwritten annotations that readers add themselves, comments, critiques, elaborations, corrections, disagreements. The margins of printed books are becoming spaces for readers to respond to the text, to argue with it, to add their own knowledge and perspectives. The margin conversations haven't ended, they've just changed form. Instead of scribes talking to each other, it's readers talking to authors. The margins remain alive with voices, just different voices, using different systems.
Thomas starts his own marginalia practice. He reads printed books and adds comments in the margins. Nothing coded, just honest reactions and observations and connections to other texts. It's remarkably freeing after decades of communicating only through deliberately obscure dot patterns. He can write actual words now, express actual thoughts. The margins are still spaces where he has agency, where he can respond to texts without asking permission, where his perspective gets recorded even if nobody asked for it.
He develops a theory about why margins attract communication. They're liminal spaces, neither part of the official text nor completely separate from it. They exist adjacent to authority, responding to it, commenting on it, sometimes subverting it, but always in relation to it. That adjacency creates possibility. You can't completely control margins without controlling the entire page, and controlling entire pages means destroying the blank space that makes documents readable. So margins remain relatively free, relatively unmonitored, relatively available for uses that the official text doesn't authorize.
Thomas writes this theory in the margins of a philosophical text about power and resistance. Nobody ever reads it. The book is one of dozens in Lord Edmund's grandson's library. Thomas's margin notes are just personal commentary that will remain private unless some future reader happens to notice them and happens to care what a retired scribe thought about political theory. But Thomas doesn't mind. Writing in margins isn't about reaching large audiences. It's about having space to think and record those thoughts adjacent to authority rather than within it.
He dies in 1512, at 65, having spent more than half his life reading and writing margins. His obituary, if he'd had one, would probably mention that he was a faithful scribe for 40 years, a loyal servant to 3 generations of the Thornfield family, a reliable producer of clean, accurate manuscripts. It wouldn't mention the margin code network. Nobody except other scribes knows that existed, and by 1512 most of those scribes are dead or retired. The network's history is disappearing with the generation that built it. Except history doesn't actually disappear. It gets preserved in unexpected ways. The manuscripts with coded margins still exist. They're in libraries and archives throughout England. Hundreds of documents containing thousands of margin dots spelling out conversations that nobody has read in decades. The code wasn't destroyed. It was just forgotten, abandoned when it became obsolete, left behind in manuscripts that got filed away and preserved as historical documents without anyone realizing they contain hidden texts.
Fast forward 400 years. It's 1912. Historians are examining medieval manuscripts with new scientific techniques, better magnification, photography, systematic cataloguing. They're noticing things previous generations missed, including dots in margins that appear across multiple manuscripts from different manor houses in 15th century Yorkshire. The pattern is too consistent to be decorative, too deliberate to be accidental. Someone is examining these dots carefully, measuring their placement, looking for patterns.
It takes 2 more decades before someone cracks the code.
A linguist in the 1930s realizes the dot placement corresponds to letters, decodes a few margin messages, discovers that entire paragraphs of text are hidden in the margins of manuscripts that everyone thought they'd already fully transcribed. The discovery is published in an academic journal almost nobody reads. It notes that medieval scribes apparently used margin dots to pass secret messages, speculates about the purposes of these messages, doesn't fully grasp the scope of what it's found. More research follows slowly over the next 50 years, different scholars examining different manuscripts, gradually piecing together that this wasn't an isolated practice, but a network, a communication system that operated for decades, a community of scribes who built something remarkable in the margins of the documents they were paid to produce. By the 1980s, historians understand that the margin code network was real, sophisticated, and widespread. By the 2000s, they've decoded thousands of margin messages and have a fairly complete picture of how the network functioned.
What they find is remarkable. The margin messages discuss everything from practical matters of scribal work to political debates about the Wars of the Roses to personal reflections about the hardships of serving noble households. They reveal that scribes had much more sophisticated understanding of politics and theology and social structures than anyone assumed. They show coordination and collective action among workers who historians thought were too isolated to organize. They prove that surveillance is never complete, that the powerful never control information as thoroughly as they think they do, that the powerless always find ways to communicate. The academic excitement about this discovery is contained mostly within medieval studies. Outside of that specialized field, most people don't hear about margin codes, don't learn that 15th century scribes built secret communication networks using tiny dots in manuscript margins, don't realize that hundreds of historical documents contain two texts, the official one and the hidden one. The discovery remains somewhat obscure, known to specialists but not to general audiences.
Until digital humanities arrives, researchers start scanning manuscripts and using computer analysis to detect margin dots that even trained human eyes miss. Machine learning algorithms identify patterns across thousands of documents. The full scope of the margin code network reveals itself through computational analysis that Thomas and his fellow scribes could never have imagined. And suddenly, it's possible to read the complete margin conversation, to see how messages flowed through the network, to reconstruct the community that existed in spaces nobles thought were blank.
Thank you for spending this time with me exploring the margin code network and what it reveals about hidden communication, resistance, and how the powerless talk to each other despite surveillance. If this story changed how you think about manuscripts, about margins, about the spaces where unauthorized conversations happen, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to Quiet Manor Story and share your thoughts. Have you ever found secret messages in books? Where do you see similar hidden communication systems today? What does this tell us about power and the persistence of margins? I read every comment, and I'm genuinely curious about your reflections on how margins remain spaces for conversation even now.
Because margins haven't stopped being spaces for communication. Modern books have margins where readers still add notes. Digital documents have comment functions that serve similar purposes. Social media has literal margins where threaded replies happen adjacent to main posts. The impulse to respond in spaces adjacent to authority, to comment from the sidelines, to add perspective that wasn't requested but feels necessary, that impulse persists, changes form but doesn't disappear. Scholars in the 21st century look at the margin code network and see a historical curiosity, evidence of medieval resistance, example of how workers organized before modern labor movements, all of which is true. But they're also looking at something that continues.
The margin codes themselves are obsolete. Nobody encodes messages with dots anymore. But the practice of using marginal spaces for unauthorized communication is very much alive, just adapted to new technologies and new forms of surveillance. The habits that Thomas developed are recognizable to anyone who's learned to read between the lines, to pay attention to what's not officially said, to notice the comments and asides and marginalia that reveal what people actually think versus what they're officially supposed to think. The skill of reading margins, literal or metaphorical, remains valuable, essential even, because authority still focuses on main texts, still treats marginal information as insignificant, still fails to pay attention to the spaces where resistance happens. The quiet rules have evolved, but their logic persists. Don't put sensitive information in official channels. Use side conversations for things that need to be said but shouldn't be on record. Test trust before sharing information that could be used against you. Maintain plausible deniability about meanings that might be problematic if stated explicitly. The specific rules change, but the pattern remains. Marginalized people still use marginal spaces to communicate, still exploit gaps in surveillance, still build networks that operate partially hidden from authority.
The threats have changed more than anything else. Thomas feared execution for treason. Modern margin communication faces different dangers: getting fired, getting blacklisted, getting exposed and shamed, loss of reputation rather than loss of life. But the fundamental dynamic remains. Authority wants to control communication. The marginalized find ways to communicate anyway. Authority thinks it's monitoring everything important. The marginalized know that margins exist where monitoring fails. Authority treats marginal information as insignificant. The marginalized use that dismissal as protective cover. The margin code network that Thomas participated in lasted 23 years before technological obsolescence ended it. But the principle behind it has lasted 500 years and counting. Margins as spaces for unauthorized communication, as places where people talk to each other despite systems designed to keep them isolated, as gaps in surveillance where communities form and information flows in directions that authority doesn't control or even notice. Modern readers examining medieval manuscripts with margin codes often marvel at the cleverness of the scribes. How did they develop this system? How did they maintain it under surveillance? How did they keep it secret for decades? The answers are simpler than people expect. They developed it because they needed to communicate. They maintained it because it exploited gaps in noble attention patterns. They kept it secret because nobles don't read margins, and have never read margins, and will probably never read margins, because reading margins would require acknowledging that marginal information might matter.
That last point is crucial. The margin code network survived not primarily because of encryption sophistication, but because of class dynamics. Nobles don't think about scribe labor, don't care about the technical details of manuscript production, consider margins too insignificant for attention. That dismissal creates space, not intentional space or officially authorized space, but gaps where people who are supposed to be powerless exercise actual agency. The margins exist because power is never total, never as complete as it pretends, never as thorough as it claims. Thomas understood this by the end of his life, wrote about it in the marginalia he added to books after the network collapsed. He realized that margins are structural, built into how documents work, how pages work, how communication works. You can't eliminate margins without destroying readability, can't fill every inch of the page with official text without making the page unusable. So margins persist, and wherever margins persist, unofficial communication remains possible. Not guaranteed, but possible. potential space for voices that weren't invited to speak in the main text.
The legacy of the margin code network isn't the specific dots or the specific messages. Those are historically interesting, but not particularly relevant to contemporary life. The legacy is the demonstration that marginal spaces remain communicatively active, that people will use whatever spaces are available to them, that authorities' blindness to margins is reliable enough to build on, that community can form in gaps too small for surveillance to bother monitoring. Modern margin readers, the people who read comment sections, who follow Twitter threads, who pay attention to what's said in indirect channels rather than official statements, are Thomas's descendants, not literally, but in practice, in attention patterns, in understanding that margins often contain more truth than main texts, that official statements often matter less than unofficial reactions, that power concentrates on controlling main messages and consistently fails to control marginal responses. The dot code is gone. The specific system that Thomas used is obsolete, but the approach remains live. Contemporary whistleblowers use modern versions of margin codes, encrypted communications, anonymized platforms, indirect channels that authority doesn't monitor closely. Contemporary activists organize in spaces that power treats as insignificant, until suddenly they're not insignificant anymore. Contemporary resistors of all kinds use the same principle Thomas discovered. Find the margins, exploit gaps in surveillance, build community in spaces that authority dismisses, communicate in ways that operate adjacent to power, rather than in direct opposition to it, where opposition can be easily suppressed.
Historians examining the margin code network sometimes wonder whether the scribes understood the theoretical implications of what they were doing, whether they recognized they were demonstrating principles about power and surveillance and resistance that would remain relevant centuries later. The margin messages suggest they didn't have a grand theoretical framework. They were just trying to talk to each other, trying to break isolation, trying to coordinate to maintain some small measure of autonomy in lives that were otherwise completely controlled by noble employers.
But that practical, modest goal produced something with much larger implications. They proved that communication can happen in spaces power doesn't see, that community can form among people who are supposed to remain isolated, that even tiny marks, dots barely visible to the naked eye, can carry messages that accumulate into networks that survive for decades. They demonstrated that margins matter, not just in manuscripts, but as a conceptual category. Marginal spaces, marginal voices, marginal perspectives that authority treats as insignificant, but that actually contain critical information about how systems really function.
The manuscripts with coded margins are now in archives and libraries. Digital scans are available online. Anyone can look at them, can see the dots if they know where to look, can read the decoded messages that scholars have transcribed. The network is no longer secret. Its messages are public record. The conversations that happened in margins 500 years ago are now accessible to anyone with internet connection and sufficient interest. But reading them requires learning to see margins as text, requires developing the habit that Thomas developed, looking at manuscripts and not just reading the main text, but examining the margins for information that isn't obvious, that wasn't meant for general audiences, that exists in liminal space between official and unofficial. That habit is what made the network possible. That habit is what preserved the network's legacy. That habit is what connects modern margin readers to medieval scribes who put dots in manuscript margins and changed what those spaces meant.
The margins spoke then. The margins speak now. You just have to learn their language, have to train your attention to see what authority dismisses, have to understand that blank space is never truly blank when people need places to communicate, have to recognize that the most important conversations often happen in spaces designed to be insignificant, have to know that dots in margins can mean everything, even when they look like nothing.
Thomas Blackwell died in 1512. His grave is unmarked. His name appears in a few administrative records from Thornfield Manor as Scribe, deceased. The manuscripts he produced are scattered across various collections, most unattributed, because scribes rarely signed their work. The margin messages he wrote are preserved in documents that sit in archives where they might never be read by anyone except occasional researchers. His physical presence in history is minimal, barely documented, almost invisible.
But his margin work remains, thousands of dots carefully placed in hundreds of manuscripts, messages that survived 500 years of storage and neglect and technological change, conversations that historians are still discovering and decoding, evidence that someone who was supposed to be powerless found ways to exercise agency, that someone who was supposed to be silent found ways to speak, that someone who was supposed to be isolated found ways to connect. The dots are tiny, almost invisible, easily overlooked, but they're there. They've always been there. They will remain there as long as the manuscripts survive.
And they teach us something essential, that margins are never empty, that surveillance is never complete, that community persists in gaps too small for power to control, that dots in margins can change habits and quiet rules and create more threats than authority realizes, that the powerless always find ways to communicate, that history happens in margins as much as in main texts, that you should read the blank spaces because they're not actually blank, that voices speak from where you least expect them, that tiny marks matter when enough people learn to read them.
The Margin Code Network operated from 1473 to approximately 1496. 23 years of coded communication in manuscript margins, dozens of scribes, thousands of messages, a complete parallel text existing alongside official documents, a community built in spaces that nobles thought were empty, a network that survived threats and adapted to dangers, and finally died only when technology made it obsolete. All recorded in dots so small they're barely visible, all preserved in manuscripts that everyone thought they'd already fully read, all waiting for someone to learn that margins speak if you know how to listen.
Thomas understood this, spent 23 years proving it, spent his retirement reflecting on it, left behind margins full of dots that spell out one consistent message repeated across hundreds of documents. We were here. We talked to each other. The margins were ours. The silence was never complete. The blank spaces were full of voices. The dots meant everything. And if you're reading this, if you've learned to see margins as text, if you've discovered that what looks like nothing actually contains something, you're part of the same tradition, the same practice, the same habit of reading the spaces between official truths. Welcome. The margins are still speaking. They've been speaking for 500 years. They'll keep speaking as long as power leaves gaps, and power always leaves gaps. That's what margins are. That's what margins mean. That's what margins will always be. Spaces where unauthorized conversations happen. Spaces that change habits. Spaces that create quiet rules. Spaces that generate more threats than authority ever realizes until it's too late and the conversation has already happened and the community has already formed and the resistance has already begun. In marks so tiny they looked like nothing, but meant everything.
The dots spell that out, all of it, across margins in manuscripts throughout England.
500 years of silent messages waiting for readers who learned that blank spaces speak. Thomas's legacy, the Margin Code Network's legacy, the enduring truth that margins matter and always have mattered and will always matter as long as documents have edges and people need places to talk.